Reform or else you'll lose relevance. A grim warning to the leaders of the Commonwealth countries as they meet in Australia. But what purpose does this huge gathering serve now? And what does it take to address its weaknesses? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. Commonwealth leaders are meeting in the Australian city of Perth to discuss ideas meant to keep the organisation relevant and active. Controversially, however, leaders have failed to endorse a report put forward by an eminent persons group which had been tasked to recommend reforms for the 54-member body. Angered at what it saw as a rejection of its report, the group decided to make its recommendations public without approval by the Commonwealth leaders. Among its suggestions, that an independent commissioner be appointed to oversee the safeguarding of human rights in Commonwealth nations. A sticky issue here is Sri Lanka, which is facing accusations of war crimes during the final months of its civil war and which is due to host the next Commonwealth summit in 2 years' time. The group has also recommended that countries repeal all homophobic laws, especially where they stall HIV awareness. And several recommendations concerning climate change were also made. These particularly important as more than half of the Commonwealth states are island nations that are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Nationals from some of the Commonwealth countries offered their points of view.
Yeah, I'm not so sure it's relevant, but I just think it's part of our traditions, and I think our traditions should be, I think we should protect them and celebrate them. So, yeah, I think there's a place for it.
Controversial subject in Australia. Some people agree, some people disagree. We had a referendum and it wasn't settled.
Our law is directly from, and there's been numerous times that I've used common law to gain, to achieve things I've wanted. So absolutely, it's still vitally important to New Zealand.
I don't know much about the Commonwealth, and nobody knows, My friend don't know about the Commonwealth, what it's for, and they're not doing anything.
Yeah, it is important. It's a kind of synergy that Commonwealth is generating.
We don't pay much particular attention to it. We just know we are part of the Commonwealth.
I'm not really too sure of what use it has anyway, so the relevance of it is pretty irrelevant to me, but I'm sure for some people it's a great thing, maybe.
For more on this, I'm joined by our three guests. From London, Richard Fitzwilliams, royal commentator and former editor of Who's Who. From Johannesburg, David Monyae, political analyst on African affairs. And from New Delhi, Suhas Chakma, political analyst and director of the Asian Centre for Human Rights. Welcome to you all. Let's begin in Johannesburg. David Monyae, why is the Commonwealth apparently reluctant to implement the reforms that the group that it tasked with making the recommendations drew up?
I think the best way of looking at the Commonwealth, it is a loose organization of countries with different norms and values. And in this case, there are a number of countries, for instance, on matters of gays, you have Uganda, you have countries such as Pakistan and others who do not really share a progressive agenda in that arena. But when it comes to democracy, it's the same issue. I think they have had problems with Zimbabwe and is outside the Commonwealth as we speak. And a number of countries whose democratic credentials are questionable, both on the African continent as well as in other parts of Asia. So these are some of the problems. They had problems of nuclear disarmament, nuclear proliferation with India, Pakistan, and these are old stories that the Commonwealth has been dealing with. And at all times, in my view, Commonwealth has failed dismally. It did well with the anti-apartheid struggle, the Rhodesia question, but there are a number of lingering issues, particularly around issues of race in the past, and this with regards to Zimbabwe. You had a division of your white Commonwealth and black Commonwealth, South Africa, Nigeria leading the black Commonwealth.
Well, we'll get into that particular issue a little bit later, David, but I'd like to go now to Suhas Chakma and get his view about why the Commonwealth does appear to be so unwieldy, particularly in relation to this report that it had commissioned.
No, I think it's the sheer hypocrisy of the government of India, which, as well as the South African government, which have been leading the campaign against establishment of a Human Rights High Commissioner. I think the key issue is, at the end of the day, there is a willingness of these southern countries, not the European ones, to address human rights violations if it is committed by the European ones. But when it comes to their own situations, they don't want to utilize the mechanisms. And I think the government of India, which is the largest democratic country, has actually openly questioned the recommendation, despite the fact that India was the first country which had led the non-aligned movement to establish the first investigative mechanisms within the UN system to investigate human rights violations against the apartheid regime. And today you find the same government, which is the largest democratic country, actually trying to defend the human rights violators, which also includes Sri Lanka. I think at the end of the day, the question is, unless Commonwealth could address difficult human rights, governance and rule of law issues, it will be irrelevant. So if you look at ASEAN today, if you look at the Arab League today, they are addressing human rights issues. But if the Commonwealth fails to address these human rights issues, obviously they will be irrelevant. And if we heard the participants or the people from the Commonwealth countries, they hardly know about it, the existence of the Commonwealth. Commonwealth must make its presence felt, and the only way to make its presence felt is to speak about the issues which concern day-to-day lives of the people, whether it's the accountability for human rights violations or war crimes in Sri Lanka, or corruptions in India, or any other forms of human rights violations. Unless they are addressed by the Commonwealth, it's going to be very difficult for the people to relate with such an institution.
Well, let's go to Richard Fitzwilliams in London. Your point of view on this?
Well, I think it's undoubtedly deplorable that the Commonwealth has basically shelved these reports by the Eminent Persons Group, because after all, it was in Trinidad and Tobago that this was set up. And there's no question that the Commonwealth, over some 40 years since Singapore in 1971, has put out, and I think has been absolutely right to put out, a series of impeccable communiques dealing with human rights. In this particular case, that asked to take one step further, to appoint a commissioner, and also to take these matters in a way which is indeed more public. The Commonwealth's very looseness seems to motivate against action here. I mean, the Commonwealth is no United Nations. It's not even definitely trying to be, nor should it. But it does seem, as reported, that there has been a split between Britain and Australia and Canada and other countries in the Commonwealth over this particular issue, because the issue of human rights is one that the Commonwealth must address. We all know the Commonwealth's strengths basically are in the international organizations that it has, which link with all the various states in ways which are less public. But it's also important, as the Queen has urged reform, which I think is very significant. And I also think that if the Commonwealth loses this opportunity, and we bear in mind that in 2013 the next conference will be in Sri Lanka, it will clearly be seen to have missed what I think is necessary, a revivifying aspect as it moves into the 21st century. It simply ought to realize that a large number of countries, and some within it, just as some are queuing up to join it, do need their human rights looked at. And with reference to gay rights, some 40 Commonwealth countries, I understand, have homophobic legislation on the statute book. So this clearly is a very sensitive issue, that I recognise.
Well, David Monyae, the Commonwealth takes its decisions by consensus. Now, this would appear to be part of the problem. It is used as an excuse by some of the Commonwealth members as to why it cannot act on some of these issues, saying that everybody has to agree or nobody does agree. But is this a problem within the structure of the Commonwealth itself, this question of consensus before any decision is made?
Yeah, partly, but we also have to put the Commonwealth in a context. This is a relic of British Empire, and as you are aware, the Queen addressed the gathering, and Britain does not carry that weight it used to carry previously, and therefore I think it cannot push some of this agenda as well as influence in a global context where there are other structures more important, in my view, such as BRICS, and other countries are looking the other way. And I think what brings us together is the issue of the language that we speak, which is English, the culture. More than that, one does not really see. And the other issue is to do with disagreement on the key issues in terms of behavior of leading Commonwealth countries. I think the colleague in India has explained, and one can say the same about South Africa, but more importantly, Britain. Under Tony Blair, the wars in Iraq, and now under David Cameron, he doesn't have that weight, and the imperial posture in Libya at the moment. I mean, these leaders are not leading with example, and therefore one wonders what's so common about the Commonwealth.
Well, let's go back to Richard Fitzwilliams on this particular issue, the question of Britain. As you say, most of the Commonwealth are former British colonies, but that question of Britain losing its influence and its ability to actually stamp its authority and its norms on the 54-nation body. Is this a part of the problem within the Commonwealth?
I think to some extent it is, because it's been claimed by some that the Commonwealth, which I think has very, very considerable value myself, is a fig leaf to hide the decline of British power. There's no question that Britain has very frequently, and I'm thinking back into the area of sanctions against South Africa, and then the way it handled the illegal government in Rhodesia in past years, has been at the sharp end of a great deal of criticism in the Commonwealth. I do think this time Britain has, for example, been especially vocal on matters in Zimbabwe. There's no doubt that there was very considerable sensitivity from other African countries, for example, South Africa, Zambia, Namibia and others, at the time when President Mugabe walked out of the Commonwealth, and this was before they realized Zimbabwe was going to be expelled. I think that there is an agenda that the Commonwealth has with reference to human rights, with reference to certain values. I mean, these have been stated in endless communiques. It's therefore up to various member states to ensure that, since so many have connections with Britain, the English language, British parliamentary democracy and so forth, that these matters are not only correctly observed, but can be seen to be, where the Commonwealth is, for example, particularly good, is monitoring general elections in various countries. But regarding Britain's specific agenda, I think that David Cameron's put it rather well. Concern about human rights in Sri Lanka, but also concern about abuse of human rights worldwide. The issue in Libya, I think, was handled by, this has been brought up, by the British and the French and various Arab nations successfully. It was controversial, but on the other hand, the Commonwealth ought to be seen to be a force for good with reference to human rights, and also be able to condemn the abuse of human rights without being too sensitive, as so many recently independent states have tended to be, understandably maybe, but nonetheless it's not just a question of who was a former colonial power, it's a question also of the rights and wrongs of individual nations and the way they're behaving.
Well, to go to Suhas Chakma and pick up on this particular issue, now, the Commonwealth appears to indicate that it does have a body to supervise or look at human rights through the world, and that is the Commonwealth Ministers' Action Group, a group of 9 foreign ministers who do have some form of oversight in terms of member countries' behavior. Yet the argument has been from the Eminent Persons Group that these are politicians, that in order to adjudicate on human rights, you need an independent body, hence the recommendation for an independent commissioner. Do you agree with the Eminent Persons Group on this particular recommendation, that it is indeed necessary?
No, I think it is indeed necessary. I would say, in fact, responding to the questions which were raised by India, that establishment of a commissioner would duplicate the efforts of the United Nations Special Rapporteurs or Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group. I think the key point is, if you appoint a commissioner, commissioner would be feeding both the Secretary General as well as the interministerial group. So it will, in a way, actually complement the efforts of the Commonwealth. I think where the ministerial groups intervenes is actually in the cases which is absolutely acute, something like Zimbabwe. But there are also a number of human rights violations which need not necessarily evoke the response of all the Commonwealth members, but still require some kind of interventions from the Secretary General or the Commonwealth. I think this is where the commissioner would be effective, and I think if we look at the way the African Union has been acting, African Union, apart from the special rapporteurs of the United Nations, has its own special rapporteurs to look into thematic issues, including human rights defenders, on the issue of freedom of expression. I think so. There is no question of duplications. I think where the problem arises is the behavior of these countries, irrespective of whether they are in the Commonwealth or the United Nations or somewhere. They have been consistently opposing any kind of international scrutiny. So the behavior of the government of India, government of South Africa, or a number of countries which are opposing these mechanisms, even at the United Nations, they have been opposing any kind of international scrutiny, And if you look at their positions either on Libya or even on Syria today, you would see that these are the countries which have been basically keeping silent, and they remain silent not because they are, supporting a particular regime. They basically try to use human rights issues or the problems for their bilateral benefits. So in a way, they will protect Sri Lanka because they have to do business with Sri Lanka, and the government of India obviously does not want the involvement of any other country, and that's where the problem arises, because they want to use human rights issues or the mechanisms for their bilateral politics, not for multilateral actions which will involve actors beyond them, and that's the key issue. So it's basically a question of tough war, whether at the UN or at the Commonwealth.
Yes, well David Monyae, I want to touch on an issue that you referred to a little bit earlier, the issue of the possibility of a racial divide within the Commonwealth. Now, the opposition of South Africa and India, it would appear, to these recommendations is rooted in the belief that these are impositions of some kind of Western norms on other countries. Is there any validity to this, do you believe?
I think my dear colleague in India put things in a very simplistic way. The assumption that India, South Africa, all these emerging countries are the ones which are shielding the abuse of human rights by dictators in other countries, I think that in itself, it's a very simplistic way of putting it. If you look at Britain and some of the countries, the campaigners of democracy, the way they behave, whether in the United Nations, and if we go back to Libya, the manner in which they behave, they don't in any way protect human rights. And even the view that the Libyan intervention was successful, it's a very value-laden. I don't think there was any success in Libya, regardless of the cases on the ground. I think the United Kingdom, as a Commonwealth member, alongside the French and the Americans, they bombed, they killed a lot of people in Libya in the name of protecting human rights. I think we need to put that very clearly. And they also deployed weapons in Libya, going against the international embargo in Libya. So there are a number of cases that one can talk about, whether we go to Iraq, and these countries are not behaving in any way that demonstrate that they're serious about human rights.
Well, Richard Fitzwilliams, I'd like you to pick up on the point that David Monyae has just made there, that there is some form of value system which is not shared by all the members of the Commonwealth and which some suspect or fear will be imposed on them.
I think that you could argue this has been the case in one way or another for quite a considerable time. For example, the right-wing press in Britain, and I'm thinking about the 1960s, 70s and 80s, when South Africa and the then Rhodesia were the headlines so far as Commonwealth conferences were concerned, and Britain tended to find that it felt itself, whether rightly or wrongly, very much in the dock at each Commonwealth conference. One tended to find the split between what I would call the old Commonwealth and, for example, African nations and recently independent countries. Yet, for example, Idi Amin, when he ruled Uganda, wasn't, as I remember it, criticised by other Commonwealth countries other than a very few, and subsequently was, interestingly enough, removed by an invasion from Tanzania, which I think is one of the very rare times that colonial borders have been disregarded in Africa, and in a right cause. I think so far as the moral issues are concerned, this is one thing that the Commonwealth is able to do, but in a rather gentler way. I mean, I very much regret the fact that there has been no commissioner for human rights appointed. I think it is a tragedy for the Commonwealth that it has not published this report, because the report, as we know, has been leaked anyway, and the organisation is no better for it. But the facts of the matter clearly are that if we look over the last 20 years, the Commonwealth has played rather an important part in Nigeria between 1995 and 99 in bringing it back for military rule. Similarly in Pakistan between 2002 and 2008. There's the issue of Fiji, which is currently on its third suspension from the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth isn't able, obviously, to deploy any form of military force, but what it is able to do is to take a very broad, very friendly, you could almost say it likes to feel, using the word family, stance. There's no doubt that if you were having a Commonwealth version of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and the partners who turned up were gay, I think it would cause a very, very considerable amount of difficulty now, because you have got different values, and you always will have, but the strength of the Commonwealth is it is loose enough to survive on one level and have the difficulties and the debates that we've talked about, and on the level which we haven't discussed, whether it's the business foundation, whether it's legal issues, whether it's the Commonwealth Games, whether it's the War Graves Commission, which of course looks over after the cemeteries in which 1.7 million Commonwealth servicemen and women lie. I mean, that shows some of the depth that the organisation has and takes it back more in history. So whereas we can disagree now, and obviously some governments are disagreeing, and some quite strongly, I do think it's an organisation that will survive simply because it has got certain important links. And also an important point to make, I think, is that some countries still want to join. Algeria, Madagascar, neither of which, just as Rwanda and Mozambique, which our members haven't, links particularly to as a past British colony. Also, I understand Sudan, Southern Sudan and Yemen. So, I mean, clearly there are difficulties on one level, but there are, I think, strengths on a different level with the Commonwealth and, of course, with the British Queen.
Let's go to Suhas Chakma on that particular point. We heard Richard Fitzwilliams refer there to the looseness of the Commonwealth as part of its strength, that it is able to be flexible and supple in terms of guiding the direction of its member states. Do you agree with this point? Do you think that there is that ability within the Commonwealth to effect change in its member states for the better?
No, I think, I completely agree with what has been said, that because it's a loose network and also there is certain amount of flexibility. And I would say that some of the situations mentioned, whether it's Zimbabwe, Fiji or Pakistan, has been effectively addressed. But I would also say that the end of the non-acceptance of the recommendations at this stage is not the end of the whole process. The fact that the eminent group of persons have recommended, it has basically created the debate. And when it goes to Sri Lanka, I am sure this issue will continue to be alive in Sri Lanka. And what I would like to say is the fact that, the recommendations which comes from the eminent groups of persons should not be seen as something coming from the white European groups, but I would say that it's a group which is headed by the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Abdullah Badawi, who himself ran a country which did not function as a proper democratic country. But if you have a former Prime Minister of Malaysia actually endorsing this view that there is a need for a commissioner, I'm sure over a period of time it will be picked up by the other countries. It will be realized by other countries that it's something to be think about and to reconsider it. I think at the international level it takes time in terms of standard setting process.
Well, let's go
look at the African Union.
Very briefly, if I may, to David Monyae. Final brief thought. Does the Commonwealth still have value? We heard there that this debate, which has begun with the Eminent Persons Group report, or the attempt to conceal this report, perhaps, that the debate has started and the Commonwealth will continue to debate the issue of human rights.
Yes, I think there are a number of issues my colleagues have covered. I think you look at the theme, food security, as well as climate change, and South Africa will be chairing COP17 in December quite soon. And I think there are a number of areas where they can continue discussing, but the manner in which Commonwealth countries treat each other, for instance, the manner in which Britain treat fellow Commonwealth citizens in itself where they require visas. Certain countries require visas,
Well,
others they
at this
don't.
point, I'm terribly
So-
sorry, David, but at this particular point, we'll have to come to an end of our discussions. But my thanks to our guests, Richard Fitzwilliams, David Monyae, and Suhas Chakma. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.com. Goodbye for now.